Every day, we are inundated by news and stories of how big businesses are despoiling the environment and accelerating climate change. We read about how companies blatantly pollute just to goose their dividends and returns. How it's too expensive for firms to somehow bear the cost of clean air or water, and hence they resist action on the climate. Hollywood has gotten involved, producing movies and documentaries that show an epic struggle between corporations and those who actually care about the environment. Disaster movies depict what happens when businesses put short-run profit ahead of long-run responsibility. Now, imagine a world where businesses actually bought into society's climate goals. After all, truth be told, it's going to be impossible for us to get to a world of net zero by 2050 without the active involvement of businesses. The road to achieving this goal by 2050 requires a decrease in global greenhouse emissions of more than 40% by the end of the decade. But where are we now? Alas, only a fraction of what is needed. Even for an advanced economy such as Singapore, the targets are formidable. Where we are is 65 megatons of carbon dioxide emissions, but we need to get to 60 by the end of the decade and rapidly decline down to 0 by 2050. Teaching in the business school, I remain a firm believer that it's possible for businesses to do good while doing well. But what's needed are nudges and coordination, a clear roadmap for how this transition is going to take place. Then we rope in the companies to work on gradually buying into this vision in reducing their carbon footprints. I see 3 key steps by which we can make this happen. First, companies need to address carbon emissions along their full supply chain and not just what they produce. Second, knowledge is the beginning of wisdom, and so they will need to monitor the carbon emissions, and with this, they'll need a group of green professionals. And third, they'll need to look to access any green financing that may be available to help them along the road to full decarbonization. The bluntest and arguably most effective measure for helping companies internalize the cost of carbon emissions is, of course, a carbon tax. Yet worldwide, only 29 countries, including Singapore, have some sort of carbon tax in place. And the average of this tax is woefully inadequate, just $3 a megaton, in spite of how experts all agree that this amount needs to be much higher. $50 today, more than $90 by 2030, and in excess of $200 by 2050. Now, this tax will not be easy to bear. By this logic, some have argued that it should be targeted at just the most egregious producers, such as major carbon emitters from the power, water, or waste sectors. Now, this would certainly absolve companies from worrying too much about their own carbon emissions. But I believe that this view is fundamentally mistaken. After all, basic public finance principles tell us that broad taxes are much preferred to narrow ones. Doing so also ensures the crucial psychological buy-in from every carbon source, which is, of course, every one of us. But perhaps most importantly, it recognizes that climate change is a global problem, and if corporations fail to consider their total carbon footprint, they may inadvertently outsource their midstream and downstream activities to other companies in jurisdictions which have much less well-defined carbon action plans. And this is increasingly being recognized by observers. It's now no longer adequate to pay attention to a company's so-called Scope 1 emissions, which are the sources of carbon production which a firm directly controls. corporations also need to address their Scope 2 emissions, which are those that are indirectly caused by the sources of energy that the corporation uses. They also need to look to their Scope 3 emissions, which are all the other actions that a company does along its value chain that produces carbon. Responsible businesses are also getting on board. This includes more than 9 out of 10 Fortune 500 companies. And these standards have been road tested by diverse firms across the world, such as 3M, Mitsubishi, Acer, Airbus, Pfizer, as well as Shanghai Zidane. What's needed is for companies, large and small, listed and private, to incorporate full supply chain carbon monitoring into their business operations. And to keep them accountable, they should make mandatory climate-related disclosures consistent with the best practices that have been defined by the International Sustainability Standards Board, or ISSB. And these practices, in turn, are informed by various environmental experts and will go toward defining modern accounting rules, such as those embedded in international financial reporting standards. Now, a mandatory monitoring and reporting regime will call for a whole new set of green skills: the ability to perform corporate carbon accounting, manage firm assets with an eye towards sustainability, as well as provide reporting on the company's environmental impact. Such capabilities are crucial to ensure firms' long-run success in a carbon-constrained world. But they're also presently scarce. That's why environmental, social, and governance standards must permeate every level of the organization. It is simply insufficient to simply appoint a chief environmental officer, another CEO, and call it a day. But rather, what we need is to train a whole coterie of green professionals who are prepared to build sustainability considerations directly into companies' workflows. Institutes of higher education will be crucial in helping us fulfill this gap. The number of sustainability-related courses in Singapore has grown steadily, doubling in 2023. There are now hundreds of courses, both longer as well as more brief, that companies can send their staff to attend. Compliance to requirements will accelerate the demand for skills in decarbonization, sustainability finance, environmental risk assessment, as well as carbon management. Businesses must hire professionals with such tools and skills, train and groom the existing workforce to be able to adopt these competencies. Studies estimate that in Singapore alone, across all sectors, there could be as many as 170,000 jobs created. And firms, large and small, will need to make climate-related disclosures. Large listed firms will need to produce sustainability reports that they send to their respective exchanges. While small firms will need to prioritize the sort of sustainability objectives that they are going to devote their time and treasure in trying to accomplish. Just like how we cannot possibly succeed in our climate mitigation efforts by focusing only on the large firms, we likewise cannot expect to get to net zero by relying only on public sources of financing. After all, our public expenditure needs are vast, and the investment gap that has to be met by companies adapting to higher carbon prices even larger. Now, some have argued that going green will incur a green premium. What this means is that borrowing costs for sustainable projects must necessarily be higher than comparable brown opportunities. After all, if we truly want to wean our companies off dirty technologies, then surely they must face higher costs of capital. But in reality, the evidence on responsible investing does not immediately point to the fact that the returns must necessarily be inferior. Others have cautioned against greenwashing. This is the practice when unsustainable projects get branded as sustainable ones, either via outright fraud or perhaps more insidiously by misleading claims of carbon offsets that would have been made in places where there wasn't going to be development anyway. Still, we shouldn't allow these very legitimate concerns to eclipse how far ESG financing has come. It has truly taken off, and in Singapore alone, we see that in just the 6 years, between 2018 and 2023, green project loans have grown by an order of magnitude. The ESG bond market has, in the same time, gone from 1 to 7 billion and is expected to grow to 35 billion by 2030. Now, there's a common knee-jerk reaction by folks who suggest that by pursuing climate objectives, what will happen is that they will add to costs and undermine competitiveness. Now, this claim, while seemingly intuitive, is at best incomplete. And the reason is simple. We need to think of environmental expenses as investments. Now, think about any kind of investment, whether in knowledge or in the latest technology or in old school plant and equipment. These investments always take time before they're going to pay off. But companies don't set aside earnings for R&D or artificial intelligence or capital expenditure just for fun. They do it because they expect that somewhere down the road, years, perhaps even decades, they will be in a more profitable position with these investments than without. The same can be said for spending on sustainability and green projects. What may sometimes seem like this money goes into some sort of cost black hole, in reality, these are investments which will pay off over time. Now, these may be direct. For example, over the past decade, we have seen sustainable energy, such as solar and wind power, become even more cost competitive than fossil fuels, even without financial subsidies. Or they may be indirect. After all, irreversible climate change, if it was to become entrenched, will entail higher business costs in insurance, as well as other expenses arising from natural disasters, for example, that we've observed in countries as diverse as Bangladesh, Mexico, Poland, Spain, and Thailand. And in the meantime, for every old brown job that is being displaced, the good news is that new green jobs will inevitably be created and take their place. There's no sugarcoating how companies will have to dig into their pockets, at least in the near term, to decarbonize. But in the future, they will ultimately reap the benefits of their green investments. This will be better not only for their bottom lines, but importantly, for the only planet that we all inhabit. So long as we as society and economy continue to direct technological change toward clean rather than dirty inputs, we'll also be able to help realize our dream of sustainable growth for our companies, for our communities, and of course, most importantly, for our children. Thank you.